Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Labour Future podcast. My name's Brendan Chilton. I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Jervis, who's down here in the
Hi,
corner.
Brendan. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Joe. And today we have a very special guest. We've got John Denham, former Labour MP for Southampton Itchen from 1992 to 2015. Great term of service in office, and a former cabinet minister as well. John was Cabinet Minister for Universities, Innovation and Skills, I think I've got that right, and Communities and Local Government. And John leads at the University of Winchester on English identity. Fantastic to have you with us, John. Thank you for being on.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now actually at Southampton, but leading on English identity and politics. But there we go.
Well, back at your home city, which is great. Yeah, well, we'll jump straight into it, John. I mean, there's a massive perception that the Labour Party has got a problem with patriotism, doesn't understand it, can't talk the language of patriotism. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I think that's very often the case. And I think that my experience is quite common to come across Labour Party members who say, well, I'm not really patriotic, I don't like talking about these things. I always make 3 points to them. I say, look, most people are patriotic. There's no reason why you as an individual should be. This is not a compulsory thing, but actually most voters are patriotic. And therefore, if we as Labour Party members disparage patriotism, decry it, we're immediately putting out a huge barrier between ourselves and the great majority of the population. The second thing is, I think there's a misunderstanding. There's a belief that patriotism is about exclusivity, that it's about ethnicity, that to talk about being patriotic, whether you're being about England or about Britain, is about a white idea of what the nation is. But that's, we're behind the times. The public have moved on. No one thought when Marcus Rashford was campaigning for kids to be fed over the summer that he was not English. No one was saying you don't belong, you don't have a voice. So actually, amongst the general public, the idea that the nation is diverse and patriotic is ahead of where many Labour Party members are. And the third thing I'd say to people is this is really fundamental to ideas of socialism or social democracy. It has to be based on some idea of a community. The whole idea of being a social democrat or a socialist is of people working together, sharing together, looking out for each other, on occasions making sacrifices for each other. If the reality of politics is it's based on nations. Yes, international cooperation and the rest is absolutely essential, but it starts with the nation. So if we're not identifying with a strong sense of the nation, what's the basis on which our social democracy or our democratic socialism is going to build? There isn't one. We just become individuals pursuing our own interests.
That's interesting, John. We've obviously had a lot of conversations through the English Labour Network about these issues. One of the questions I get asked is why English identity? Why are we talking about England and not so much about Britain?
Well, there's a couple of reasons I could give for that. One is that there's actually a crucial part of the electorate that always tells the pollsters that they are English rather than British or more English than British. So it's a very important identity to probably a third of the population. So it's not everybody, and there are plenty of people in England who are British, not English, or more British than English. But there are more people who lean towards their English identity. And secondly, they are the group of people who beat the Labour Party in the 2019 election. So if you look at who the voters were who voted for Boris Johnson, including in those Labour seats that we lost, they were overwhelmingly people who were English, not British, or more English than British. Labour actually won the 2019 election amongst people who were more British than English, or British, not English. But we lost amongst the equally English and British and the people who were more English than British. So one reason you need to do it is there's a whole load of people out there who don't think we're talking to them when we only talk about Britain and we don't talk about England. So that's the first point. The second thing is that England is a reality. You don't pay the same university fees in Scotland, Wales, and in England. England has separate policy. England has different social
we know it.
Yeah. And look at the disaster of COVID, right? This is the UK government taking particularly disastrous decisions in England. So yes, some of them were shared with Wales and Scotland, but most of the most disastrous decisions were actually taken by the UK government in England. So England exists as a place with its own laws, its own policy, its own administration. But when we talk about Britain, we're talking as though England doesn't actually exist. So there's a real fundamental democratic reason for talking about English policy, how it's made, how England is governed.
Sure. And do you think Labour have been doing that at all in recent weeks in regard to COVID? I mean, obviously taking on board all those points around how it's England that's got the worst death rate in Europe, and it's the UK government's failures. Do you think Labour's really managed to drum that message home?
I don't see Labour doing very much to actually say there are some differences, some important differences between the way things have been done in Wales and the way things have been done in Scotland and Northern Ireland. They could have done more than that. So I think by default, if anything else, Labour tends to talk about the failures of the government without actually understanding that some of these are, so for example, the decisions on COVID to take all the decisions centrally, to cut public health directors out of test, track and trace. That's not what's happened in Wales. They're much more effective in Wales because they've worked with local government. The decision to privatise with Deloitte's and Serco, test, track and trace, the appalling provision of PPE, these have been UK decisions taken for England that have been particularly disastrous, and we now know this week that England's excess death rate is higher than Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the worst in Europe. So I think more could have been done to point out this is one of the consequences of the way that England's governed. It's not just that England doesn't have the same democratic powers as Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. We have a particularly centralised system of government in England, which in a crisis like this has failed us very badly.
John, do you think, I mean, obviously England has, out of all the nations of Europe, suffered the most with COVID-19. Yeah. Do you think that this could lead to the development of a new constitutional settlement for England or greater calls for more devolution parts of England? How do you think this will play out in the future, specifically to England?
Well, I hope it will. I mean, there are many different pressures for a constitutional change. There's obviously the continuing demands in parts of Scotland for independence. We're about to have a complete car crash over the return of powers from Brussels with Brexit. So there'll be a huge row in the autumn over the internal market bill that the government's bringing forward, where essentially the UK government is saying whatever standards we set for England are the ones you'll effectively have to adopt in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. So they'll be overruling 20 years of devolution. They're not admitting that, but that's actually what they're going to plan to do. So you have all of these issues, and then the dissatisfaction with the way England is governed, its centralism, its lack of democracy, ought to all add to this mix of a different view of the constitution. And I think this is long overdue. I mean, we should be, I want the union to continue, but it's got to be nations coming together because it's right for us in the 21st century, not because it was right for us in the 19th century. And too often, I think the argument for the union is based on a backward-looking view of history rather than a forward-looking view of what should a set of 21st century nations, all of which have got pride, all of which have got interests, what's the basis on which should they cooperate together to be effective in the 21st century?
Okay. Joe?
Yeah, sure. Just, I suppose one of the stumbling blocks we get, there's a couple of stumbling blocks we get from people within, or conversations we have with people in Labour who say a couple of things. They say what about Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and they say, how does Labour express itself in terms of England without offending those other nations? I guess is a question.
Well, if you're in the Labour Party in Scotland, you would have no difficulty in talking about Scotland when you're talking about Scotland, and talking about Britain or the Union when you're talking about Britain or the Union. Yeah. So why is that a problem if you're in England?
I'm playing devil's advocate here. I agree with you, John.
I do not understand the problem. But let me take it more fundamentally, because what's the way forward out of this for the Union as a whole? Three things we need to understand. The empire has gone, the old imperial constitution, we're working our way through that to a different relationship between the nations, of which England, if you like, is the bit we haven't even begun to deal with. We're in a situation at the moment where if you're outside England, you look at England or the UK government and you think that's an English government imposing stuff on us, because we're fed up with politicians, and Boris Johnson's been doing it in the last week, thinking that Britain is really the extension of England, and that the other nations have no real power or authority. If you're in England, you have a nation which doesn't decide its own legislation, hasn't got any national forum where the future of the nation is discussed. So what do you need? You need a constitution that guarantees the rights of the smaller nations and of Northern Ireland to stop English politicians taking decisions on issues that they should be taking, and one that gives England a proper democracy and a proper national forum itself. So that's the way you solve the problem. So if you actually talk about England as a mature democracy, you actually have a constitution that protects the rights of Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. And that's the way the Labour Party should be talking about it. One final point, if I can. People in the Labour Party who say, what about Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland? They often talk as though there's a UK politics, right? And that somehow this disrupts this. There isn't a UK politics. In Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland, elections are contested by different political parties, and different political parties win in each of those different political spaces. That's the reality. There isn't a politics of the UK. When I was a kid, the swing from Labour to the Tories or vice versa was the same in the north of Scotland as it was in the southwest of England. That disappeared probably 40 years ago. So we've got to live in a reality where the political debates in England and the political parties that contest England are not the same ones as contest Scotland or of Wales. And of course, Northern Ireland is entirely different.
John, we don't have, I mean, we have Scottish Labour, we have Welsh Labour, there is a kind of London Labour also developing informally, but we don't have English Labour. We've got your English Labour network, but we don't have a formal structure within the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Is that something we've neglected? Is that something Keir needs to take forward in his programme for leadership? How do you think that should play within the Labour movement?
Well, I think there should, I mean, there's two separate questions. There's our internal structures and, if you like, our branding. I have always felt candidates should be entitled to describe themselves as English Labour if they wish to do so. But that's not something that I think needs to be mandated. But more importantly, the Labour Party in England should be democratic. So if you are in the Scottish Labour Party, you get a say in drawing up the manifesto for the Scottish Labour Party, right? You get, as a Scottish Labour Party member, the chance to determine what higher education policy in Scotland should be. As an English Labour Party member, I have no say in what that policy should be in Scotland. But Scottish Labour Party members can participate through the NEC and the other structures in determining higher education policy for England. So why is there not even a forum in the Labour Party, which I mean, I don't know what the constitution will look like, but Joe and I worked on this. The existing regional policy structures in the National Policy Forum could have been used to create a stage at which English consultative structures were consulted directly on the manifesto for England, right? I would accept you still need an NEC structure and some of these issues spill across borders. But you could at least say people living in England who are going to be affected by what the Labour Party does in England should have a say in English Labour Party policy. They have no say in that at all. And when last year the party produced loads of policy documents for consultation, they were a complete dog's breakfast. They mixed up English issues, union-wide issues, and devolved issues extraordinarily, as though the people who wrote them were sitting in London in the headquarters, not realising that different people take the decisions in Scotland. So there's even the most basic heart of the Labour Party. We produced a video, right, about water privatisation, saying that we were going to take back control of Britain's water. But water's not privatised in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. It's a purely English issue. But whoever put that video together had no idea what the actual position was with privatisation, let alone have the nous to say, in England, the Tories make you pay for privatised water. So it could have been a great electoral issue. So this lack of English awareness runs right through the Labour Party in quite a damaging way.
Sure, John, and often you talk about the need to tell national stories or a national story for England, or talk in that kind of language, and I think talk about using the kind of nation, using patriotism as a kind of form of solidarity in order to bring everyone forward in a progressive way, if you like. What does that look like in practice for the Labour leader, for instance? You know, what kind of things should he be doing differently and saying differently, and how should he be talking, whether it's in interviews or in speeches? What does that look like?
Well, I think what's very important is to talk about what we share in common as a nation, okay? To talk about what unites us rather than what divides us. To talk about the importance of people working together for a fairer and more just society, but then rooting that in the history of the islands. Now, this is partly about England and partly about Britain. You don't separate out the two necessarily. But we clearly are a much more diverse society now than we were 40 years ago. So our national story today has to include those English identifying voters who are not primarily from ethnic minorities, who feel strongly English, who often feel left out of the national story. But it also has to include the stories of those people whose families have come here in the much more recent past and who are going to be part of making England's and Britain's future story in the future. So what the Labour leader needs to do is to find the language to talk about the country as it is today, and how all the people who are in it came to be here, and how we're going to shape it in the future. And on the England-Britain thing, I mean, it's quite a simple thing. If you're talking about England, talk about England. And if you're talking about the United Kingdom or Britain, talk about the United Kingdom, Britain. It's not that difficult. But I think that with a very divisive Conservative government, and also a country that is still quite bruised, whichever side you were on, by the Brexit debate, feels bruised by what wasn't a great nation building process. We need a political leader who can talk about the Labour Party in a unifying way and how we are going to be for the people who want to make this country work. That also, though, gives us some dividing lines. It enables us to say, it's not a great idea that so much of our industry and our services have been sold overseas. It's not a great idea that so much of our business is run by people based in tax havens. You can draw a distinction between those people who are working for the common good in the nation and those people who are simply lining their own pockets. They're the ones who are not the patriots. Doesn't matter if they like to wrap themselves in a Union flag from time to time, they're not the patriots. So you use the national story also to make it very clear there's a difference between those who are working for the good of the people as a whole and those who are simply not.
John, to do this, of course, Keir Starmer, he's got a huge majority within the Labour Party, but he needs to carry the Labour Party and the Labour movement with him. Now, why do you think there has been this sort of difficulty within the Labour movement to deal with these issues? What is it on the centre-left of politics in this country that makes talking about identity, we talk about identity on many issues, but we don't talk about identity, the English identity? I think that is what.
Well, I think it's partly because the changing nature of the membership of the Labour Party has created a party where, if I'm honest, lots of people don't identify personally with these issues. Now, I'm not saying they're bad people for that, but it's just the way they are. So if you have a membership which is increasingly middle class, increasingly graduate, you're actually tapping into that pool of people who are less likely to identify as English. So when I go around doing meetings with the English Labour Network, for example, constituency Labour parties, I do something which is called the Merino scale. So I ask people to say, are you English, not British, more English than British, and so on, through to British, not English. In the population as a whole, about 30% of the population is more English than British, and about 40% of the population is equally English and British, right? You go to a typical Labour Party meeting, you'll find about 80% of the audience is British or more British than English. And you'd be amazed if more than two hands go up to say they're English, not British. So you've got a membership that doesn't feel these issues personally. It's often concentrated in the seats where we win, which are also the seats that tend to be, we lose the seats where people are more inclined to be English rather than British, and we win them where they're more inclined to be British. So there's a gap. And so in many ways, the political education job that needs to be done is not to go around saying Labour Party members, well, you're just completely wrong because you've got the wrong national identity. I mean, that won't get us anywhere. It is a matter of saying to people, do not assume that the way you see the world is the way that all voters see the world. Don't assume if somebody says they are English, that they are a knuckle-dragging member of the English Defence League. They're actually perfectly ordinary people who are proud to be English and proud to be patriotic and all the rest of it. So have a bit of respect for other people's identity. So I think there is an educational job to be done with party members in understanding it. And of course, this is where you start feeling old, but if I go back 40 years, the weight of the trade union movement in bringing working class people into the Labour Party was far greater than it is today. The trade unions are still a very important part of the Labour family, but they're not the sort of transmission belt of talent through the shop stewards movement to become councillors, to become Labour members of Parliament that they used to be. So that Labour working class voice is not as well reflected in the party's discussions as it used to be. And I think that's particularly strongly at constituency level. It's less dramatic, obviously, at a national level, but the mix of party members in most CLPs is quite different to what you would have found 2 generations ago.
Absolutely, absolutely. Joe?
Yeah, John, I was just going to ask, I mean, what do you think the key tangible things, if you're say you're working the leader of the opposition's office, or you're having some influence over how the party moves forward, what are the kind of 2 or 3 key messages about what they can do here and now, that if they're writing a speech for next Saturday, or if they're whatever, what are the kind of key things you would tell them to do, the tangible things?
Okay, well, firstly, I would say when you're talking about England, talk about England. Don't talk about this country. Don't talk about Britain when you mean England, not least because that really pisses off people in Scotland and Wales when Labour leaders or any other leaders use Britain when they're not talking about Scotland or Wales. So get your language right. Secondly, I would be talking seriously about how England would be governed under a Labour government. Because at the moment, the government departments that deal with English affairs don't meet as an English government, as a civil service administration. It's all badly coordinated. You get bad policy, and I would use COVID to say we're going to do that. I'd talk seriously about devolution within England, and I would do it as a basis of saying we won't get better government until we've got decentralisation. So I do those things. I would say now that at the next election, there will be an English manifesto setting out what a Labour government would do for England. And I do that not just because it's democratic and it's right, but because we will at the next election be back in the debate about will Labour be forced to depend on Scottish MPs or Welsh MPs that might be Labour MPs if we do better in Scotland, or will they be forced to depend on the SNP in order to impose policies on England? And so you need to have an English manifesto to say the only things a Labour government would do for England are the things that are in the English manifesto. We wouldn't be pushed around by other people to do that. So, and then I'd certainly develop the national story, and I'd talk about the union. And he's already talked about the union, but I'd go further and I would say the union we need now is a union for the 21st century that works for all 4 nations, not a backward-looking union. And that's one in which England should have its own voice, but the position of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland should be protected against an overbearing England that's trying to tell them what to do. So all of those sorts of areas, I think, could begin to change the tone about how the party discusses things.
Sure. And on the constitutional element there, I mean, where do you think England should end up? Do you think you think we should eventually get to an English Parliament, or do you think just devolution straight from Westminster? Do you think a dual mandate Parliament with English MPs sitting some days, UK MPs sitting some days to debate English issues and other days to debate UK-wide issues? What do you think that could? Where would you want to get to?
Okay, 2 things. One is that England, alone of the nations, has not had a chance to consider its own position. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, I can't remember if I made this point, but Scotland's had 2 referendums the last 21 years. Wales has had 2 referendums the last 21 years. Northern Ireland's had its own process, its own referendum. It will have future consultations about its status. England has had no chance to discuss how it wants to be governed. So I don't think it's for me or you to say what the English future should be, so much as saying there needs to be a real consultative process with citizens' assemblies and all the rest of it. Not an elite conversation of various politicians getting together and saying, if we did this, would we control it? You actually go out and have a proper democratic conversation. If I look at the polling, of which we've now got a great deal over many years, I think it is very clear that most people in England today would opt for what's called a dual mandate Westminster. So rather than a separate parliament for England, I might like that idea myself, but that's not the point. If I look at where the public is, they tend to think of Westminster as their parliament anyway. And they probably, being reasonably sensible, don't want to pay for a whole bunch of new politicians in a new building when they've already got a building. So they'll probably say, let's have rather than the bureaucratic thing that nobody understands at the moment, a process in which English laws are entirely made by English members of parliament. There is support for that in every section of the population in England, including majority support amongst people who are British, not English. So as a democratic question, people like that idea, even if they're not bothered about being English as an identity point of view. So that to me would be the crucial change that you should make. And I think we need to look for incremental change. The idea of a big bang constitutional convention where you sort out everything from the union, a federation, the House of Lords, the electoral system, English devolution, all being agreed in one big package, that's for the birds. That will never happen. You can never manage to get that degree of agreement. So I think it's going to be a bit like Scottish and Welsh devolution. You do it, it's a bit messy, then you go and do the next stage and you allow the thing to evolve. So I think starting with a dual mandate parliament is almost certainly where the public is, and it would be a very achievable change.
John, you at the beginning of this discussion, you touched on the fact that the 2019 election, for want of a better phrase, the English vote consolidated behind one party, wasn't ours. Obviously, Labour needs to tackle this. We've got a few years before the next general election. If we don't deal with this issue, or at least start to change, I mean, what do you think Labour's future prospects for England are? What do you think our chances of regaining some of those Midlands and Southern, where we are in the southeast of England? What's our prospects?
Well, I think they're not good, and I think there are two things. It's not just a matter of identity; it's a matter of the politics of those groups of voters. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who didn't vote for us in 2019 were also largely the people who voted for Brexit. And for all the stuff that gets thrown at people, the Brexit vote for those voters was a lot about national identity, democracy, and sovereignty. And I think the reason they went so solidly for Boris Johnson in the last election was that he was able to define the issue in the election as get Brexit done, right? And against a Labour Party that had agreed not to really have anything to say about Brexit because it was very difficult and there was a tension between the voters and the members and other voters and the rest of it. Now, if in future elections, the Tories are able to continue to define politics around ideas of democracy, sovereignty, and the nation, which they might do in quite unpleasant and populist right-wing ways, Labour might struggle to get back in there. If Labour can shift the election more onto economic issues, many of these voters are to the left of centre economically. Okay, so they voted for Tories, but most of the people who went to the Tories in 2019 are actually to the left of most Tory voters and way to the left of most Tory MPs. So it partly depends what the framing of future issues is. My view, though, is that issues of democracy, whether people are being listened to, whether they're being taken notice of, are not suddenly going to disappear from our politics. So we need to be talking about the nation, we need to be talking about democracy, we need to be talking about to people who don't currently think they're being listened to.
So John, I mean, tell us more then, we've got a few minutes left. Just tell us about the English Labour Network, tell us how people can get involved and how they can join, if they agree with what you're saying today, if they can sign up and campaign with you.
So we started the English Labour Network a few years ago, and we've always said that we're for Labour in England and for England in Labour. So what we're trying to say is that we want to help Labour win everywhere in England. So we're very much part of the party. We're not a pressure group on the party. We want the parties to succeed. And secondly, though, we are there to raise these questions of English government, English democracy, and English identity within the Labour Party. And just go on our website, easy to sign up as a supporter. We had, prior to the calling of the 2019 election, a series of regional events around the country talking about these issues. Some of us are now trying to engage with the new leadership and the new discussions on these issues that are taking place. And I just think one of the things we really need to do and want to do is help activists and the party itself think about how these might make a difference to their local practice. You know, it's all right having these intellectual arguments about English identity and whatever. You know, unless you can say to a party member, what does that mean about that I'm going to do differently next week to what I did last week? It's not really helpful to them. So, you know, just to give you one example, in our regional workshops was quite interesting. The party has a policy of having St. George's Day bank holiday, along with bank holidays for the other saints' days. And actually, just by throwing out the question, how would you in your local Labour Party or your local council or community run a St. George's Day event that you were happy with, that reflected Labour values, but was about England and was about England's National Day? How would you do it? And people found that a really interesting discussion, because, you know, I could make the point to them, well, it's a bit silly if our government imposes a St. George's Day policy and the only people who won't take part is the Labour Party. So how do you do that? And people, of course, bring great ideas about local history, about local community events, about inclusive events, about people bringing different national stories together, about storytelling events. In other words, people began to see how they could weave this idea of English identity and the nation into their everyday politics. And we want to try and do more of those sorts of things.
And one of the messages we put out there, John, isn't it? I mean, you've said this a couple of times today, but I think to make it really clear, we're not saying that everything has to be about England the whole of the time. People say to me, why are you focusing on this issue? Why aren't you focusing on the NHS or the welfare state or whatever? And we're not saying, we're not trying to replace everything by talking about England all the time, or not talking about Scotland, not talking about Wales. We're saying, don't leave England out of the conversation. Say England when you mean England, and do talk about these issues and discuss these issues. Otherwise, Labour's probably not going to progress in the way we need it to. So I just thought I'd end with that message.
Yeah, I agree. And some of that's very simple. If you're talking about England, say England. It's just as simple as that. If you're talking about schools, you're not, if you're in the Labour Party in England, talking about schools in Wales. You're talking about
Absolutely.
English schools. Just call them English schools.
John, it has been a fascinating discussion, a real tour de force of the issues around English identity. I'm exhausted. But thank you so much for coming on. We will post a link to the English Labour Network website on here. And to our listeners and viewers, chip in. Tell us what you think. If you disagree, say so. If you think it's an excellent idea, sign up and support the cause. Thank you, everyone. It's goodbye from me and Joe. Goodbye, everybody.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.